I am happy to be here with our panel this afternoon. And I know that some of the folks on the panel were not here yesterday, so I thought it might be a good idea to start with introductions. And so, Patrick, could you just say who you are and a little bit about yourself for Anna Maria?
Yeah, sure. So I am, Patrick, obviously. I'm just finishing up my PhD in developmental psychology at UC Davis, though I am from BC, and did my undergrad at UVic. And I'm mostly interested in like sensory experiences, though I do have various other things like what I was mentioning about the naturalistic interventions earlier. You know, I have many side projects and side interests. And I'm autistic, if I didn't say that. I always forget to say that because I assume that everybody knows that about me because I'm so out about it.
Hi, I'm Chamila, and I have a son, 15 years old, with autism.
I will speak to my research now. I am Anna Maria. I'm a community pediatrician. I am an accidental researcher. I have no research training or experience, but what ended up happening is that in clinic, I kept identifying themes and issues and systemic things, and I was like, we got to do better, and so that launched kind of a research program. And it's varied. It's all about health equity. It's all about improving the system. And I'm very, very well supported by many medical students that give their labor of love to the program. So that's who I am.
Can I just get you to add one little bit about your past life too? Because it is a bit
That I was
of
a teacher?
unique path, yes.
Yeah, I was a teacher before becoming a pediatrician. And I think a bigger piece actually of like my interest in health equity, I was a single mom going through medical school, and so that like the issues that you kind of experience and live are very, very different than the issues that you kind of like talk to people about and share. So yeah.
Thanks.
I'm Nicole Shear. I go by Nikki to most people. I'm an assistant professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. There I focus mostly on cognitive neuroscience research, but I'm really interested in sensory processing, specifically sensory motor interactions. So how differences in the way that we process sensory information then influence our motor behaviors. I focus a lot on things like speech motor control and language production and things of that sort. But just more broadly, I'm really interested in how differences in sensory processing may then influence our other experiences. Because as I said during my talk, sensory is our primary way that we experience the world. So I really do believe that any differences in sensory processing have a dramatic effect on how we function.
And I'm Connor Kerns. I'm a registered psychologist here in British Columbia, an associate professor at UBC in the psychology department. And my research focuses on anxiety and stress-related disorders or conditions in people on the autism spectrum, how we assess them and treat them, particularly understanding the distinct ways that they may be experienced and manifest.
Thank you. So we've got a large panel here, and we also have Grace and Alina as researchers in the audience. They said, well, we don't need to be at the table. We've also got other people, Keith and Leaf, who are here today that weren't here yesterday. And so I invite you folks, as well as anyone in the audience, to also say your piece. And we want to hear from you. We want to hear your thoughts. The first thing that I wanted to just sort of put out there as we reflect on the last 2 days is if you are thinking about the research that you saw someone else present, either yesterday or today, I invite you to offer up I didn't think of it that way, and I want to know more about. Were there any times like that you folks would like to share?
I have one. I was just telling Patrick this over coffee earlier, which is reactions to unexpected sensory stimuli that can be kind of inconsistent. We were just talking about this. So a loud sound when you know it's coming is fine, maybe even enjoyable. But if it's an unexpected loud sound, that would be very aversive. I think I had always traditionally thought of that as probably more of an anxiety response. It's more of the uncertainty. But because of the discussions the last 2 days and my conversations with Patrick, it also seems really clear how big a part attention is and the context is, actually. And just because that's a part of the picture doesn't mean that it's not sensory. In fact, attention may be a huge part of sensory experience. So it's actually really changed my conceptualization of it. I feel like I learned a lot, and thank you.
Others?
I think sort of related to that, I think being part of all of these sessions and hearing everyone talk, it really just reaffirmed that when we're thinking about all these different things, we can't think about them in silos. We need to really pay attention to how they interact with one another. And when we're running our studies as researchers, we need to make sure that we're understanding the full picture. We even talked about stress and how that can affect things. There's all these different factors to take into account. And not that I didn't already know that, but I think it's so helpful to come and sit and talk with people in environments like this and just see how impactful those interactions are, to really remind myself as a researcher that I can't think of these things independently.
And I like the idea of anxiety, like kinds of anxiety, because we just say anxiety, we don't think about the kinds of anxiety. So I can see my son is like a delay language. So he doesn't have certain, I know that there are certain anxieties he doesn't have, there are certain anxieties he has. At the same time, sensory processing, the subtypes of sensory processing, and then the sensory processing goes with the attention and the communication and the anxiety. So it goes hands in hand, so that is really helpful, that research.
This is a somewhat harder question for me because, of course, Connor, you're working with the mind, so I've already heard you talk. Nikki, I read your papers. Tiffany, of course, I know very well. So a lot of what was heard were things that were already familiar to me, but I have been thinking about that virtual reality idea that was mentioned yesterday by multiple people, and then Nikki, you're doing work on. I need to think more about virtual reality and its potential for doing more sort of naturalistic, ethologically valid sensory research. I think there's a big gap between the real world stuff that we're looking at and sort of what we're looking at in lab, and that virtual reality piece is really interesting.
I don't know. I feel just like so out of my league or depth because I'm not I'm a clinical assistant professor at UBC as well and an investigator at BC Children's Hospital Research Institute, but what I do is so different because it's not based in academia, and so there's no it's just about answering questions in the clinic. I think when you guys were talking, the one thing that kind of struck me is the double, the double empathy problem. But do we have a similar double empathy sensory approach? The idea of has anyone taken into account the sensory experiences kind of as a double empathy, through a double empathy lens, right?
Yeah,
It'd be interesting.
Temple Grandin's been talking about that for decades, I feel,
I think as a DAR theory, that's part of it, is trying to develop empathy so that your emotional centers are matching.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
No, I meant more I think that we're approaching research from an understanding neurodivergent sensory profiles as opposed to taking a neurodivergent approach on neurotypical sensory profiles.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
That's kind of I don't know, just as people were talking, but that's just the question that came up when you guys were talking about your research. I think it would be interesting to find what the other side would be.
So I just want to go back to the comment that Anna Maria just made related to being out of our league / depth, and also thinking about what Camila just mentioned around that potential separation between the academia piece and the clinical piece and the parent piece. Thinking about the content that we heard yesterday and today when we were looking at the assessment, for example, who are the responders, or the parents who are the responders. Well, what would happen if we had other people that were responding? What if it was a teacher or a school psychologist or that individual themselves? And I guess as I think about this, and silos is a word that Nicola's used earlier, what can we do to sort of bridge that? I know Grace and I have had conversations brief about the approach in Israel since 1974-75. They've been working together, collecting biometric data and behavioral data and every aspect of development on autistic individuals. And so there's a wealth of information there. And yet here I feel like, well, we've got SFU and UBC in the same room today, so that's a start, right? Because I feel, and I know that in my work as an educator prior to joining the team at ACT, there was this siloing effect. Not only were the universities not necessarily communicating, but Ministry of Child and Family Development versus Health versus Education and Childcare weren't always communicating. And I find that where those partnerships have occurred, they've occurred from sort of the ground up, right? So I was at an ACT event actually when I met Robin Friedlander the first time, and that then sparked how can we get together and get health and education working together, and how can we include MCFD, because they're never at the table, and we've been able to do that, but we've been doing that sort of in an organic way. We haven't been doing it in a systematic way. Grace, you mentioned earlier to Anna Marie about the SIB clinic, and well, who's there? And so why doesn't Grace know about the SIB clinic at PAFN, right? So I guess as we're thinking about future directions for research, but also for just how we work with each other and different policies and systems, what is it that we can do to address some of these issues?
Well, I think meetings like this are a good first start. I was thinking when you said you don't have your qualifications, I think being part of this, I learned more from clinicians and from people with lived experiences than I did from the other researchers, because I'm, like Patrick said, he's read the papers. We hear academics talk all the time. We don't really get the opportunity to hear clinicians and people with lived experience talk. So I think most of the points I was scribbling down throughout the conversations were more based on those sorts of points rather than any scientific facts, because again, as a researcher, I can go home and download those papers, but I can't find your experience anywhere online and use that to inform my research. So it's very, very helpful.
And at the same time, Remy and I have had conversations, because the aid on the ACT website, the focus has been on what practical resources can support families. And so I come across a research paper and I think, well, this would be really, really great information to get out there, but we haven't historically put that information out there because it was quote unquote too academic. So one of the things that I've noticed lately appearing in abstracts for journals is the abstract and the lay abstract, and I really appreciate that. And so we are still in communication, but we've said, how can we have take our ACT aid and say, okay, resources for autistic adults, resources for parents, guardians, family members, caregivers, and then another section for professionals. Because when we look at education, for example, we want people engaging in supports that are evidence-based, promising practices, emerging practices.
Go ahead, Patrick. Okay, sorry. This is, such a great and important question, and it is really, a problem. Everything you're saying, Michelle, Nikki, so the question of like the lay abstracts in journal articles. They're definitely an improvement, but a lot of them are just not very good, and they're not very good for for reasons that are not necessarily on a lot of researchers' radar, because we aren't thinking about it as Nikki says. The way we're thinking about it is different. So there's actually a couple of journal articles that recently came out that were saying like, oh, all these lay abstracts are unreadable because they use language that is too higher order and everything, and that's all very well and good to point out, and it is a problem, but the even more fundamental problem is some of these things are just like 100-word long little things that said like, hey, we ran a study on like this and this and this, and don't really tell you what they actually found or what they did or anything really useful. There's some really great things like Autism in Adulthood. That journal has these really nice, detailed, plain language community briefs, and the editors do a really good job of working with the researchers to make sure that the community brief is something that is comprehensible and understandable to folks in the community. But a lot of, all the other journals really don't invest that sort of energy or thought into it. But Autism in Adulthood, the other thing about it is that this is a journal that is working in close partnership with people in the community. They have community reviewers looking at every journal article that's submitted to the journal, which is not something that other journals do. And that, I think, speaks to a more general issue, that the way that research is sort of funded and structured right now, we are incentivized to, write a lot of publications relatively quickly. And what we really need to be doing is working more with community members in partnership, which is more difficult because you have to like slow down and you have to work with people and involve them meaningfully and make sure that everything is understandable and make sure that you are sort of sharing decision-making power in a way that is meaningful, and you have to compensate community members for their time because unlike us, they don't get anything out of being a co-author on a project, so that is not necessarily beneficial if it has no relevance to their careers. It's just time that they are donating to us. And the way that our grants are funded, you're supposed to like come in with an idea for a grant and you explain your idea and then you get funding to go and do it as quickly as possible. And what we really need to be doing is giving people the resources to develop community partnerships so that community members can say what it is that needs to be done, and then we have to support these partnerships of people to go about doing that. And those partnerships, they can include all sorts of different people from communities, both professionals as well as self-advocates and family members, whoever happens to be relevant to the particular sort of focus of the project. And then you get that nice lens with all the different perspectives, so that you don't have to go to like some special event once in a blue moon in order to like talk to real people who are having these real experiences. But it's a very different way from set up from the way things that are largely structured now. There is a push though to change things.
Lovely. I'm gonna jump onto that because even though I feel like I live in both worlds because I'm in academia but not an academic, I'm in community, and so it's like this very, I don't have any rules. I don't have anybody telling me the number of publications I need per year, so I can do whatever study I want, get my grants, because I have this affiliation to UBC. It is all done on my days off, on my weekends, on the days I don't see patients, but it's a passion. But like things that I'm doing now, like I did a quality improvement project where we did, so you interview parents and providers and caregivers and whatnot. And yes, we'll try to get our publication, but we've hired, we're doing a presentation, and so we have to do a poster, and instead of doing a traditional poster, I've hired a graphic artist to represent it graphically, because I'm no, why are we sticking to these rules? Because I don't I don't get penalized for not following them because I'm a pediatrician in the community. The other thing I'm doing, I think in the middle of organizing like an art exhibit, I'm going to get artists to like interpret another qualitative interview to see if we get different themes or different expressions. Like, what does it look like when an artist does a visual representation of your results, like your discussion being visual as opposed to like, you know, standard form that you flip through. So I do find like a lot of joy in what I do because there are no rules. So.
Jealous.
A big part of academic training is supposed to be knowledge dissemination. And it's a big part of the grants that we write, and increasingly so, I think, and it's a really important part of the training that we provide to our graduate students as well. So I love the idea of a BC Autism Conference that's maybe even broader than what was happened today, which was, I think, fantastic, where you have an opportunity for families and providers in BC to take workshops with researchers here and clinicians here, to hear about the research directly and ask questions of the researchers that's going on. And I think, we could tell researchers, try a TED-style talk, right? That's more about, can you concisely get to the main points, and please put good references because there will be other researchers in the audience checking on what you're saying. But, the point of this is about getting the ideas across, including important details about how it's done and the limitations, but it's about communication so that families and providers can ask about that. And, another thing that we do in academic conferences are kind of posters where you kind of walk around and you ask students about their developing work. And really the students are the future, right? And that's what's really cool. And there's a lot of great, really talented graduate students here in British Columbia. And I think that would be invaluable experience for them to actually practice talking about their ideas, figuring out how to make a poster that is more translatable, right? And talking to families, not only just other academics, about what they've done. It's really, really important. And it's just also a way to bring all of these wonderful researchers and providers, all of this expertise that we have, for us to come together. I mean, maybe we could even have a panel on like advocacy and lobbying for key issues on health,
I love this idea, Connor, and I'm just going to add a small addendum,
Yes.
which is that I think it should be done in the summer when we reliably know that it will be like okay weather outdoors, so that you can do it outdoors so that the sound will disseminate. You could put like a tent canopy above it just in case. There's this hotel in San Diego where the Gatlinburg conference was a couple of times, where they just have all the posters in this big tent, and it makes it so much more accessible for the those folks who are sensory hyper responsive to sound because of like the hyperacusis, the sound intolerance, whatever's going on. Also, Alina, sorry I forgot to like acknowledge you in my list of like people whose work I already knew about, but I already knew about the grant that you were talking about.
So we started some ACT chats. We've done one. We've got another one in May. And that was what we conceived of, is how can we provide sort of 2-hour sessions for people on particular topics. Topic 1 was navigating the educational school system, because I've been there for 33 years. So the next one will be transitions to adulthood. But I think that's a great idea, connecting with you folks at the university to bring out, what students do you have that are doing what, that has implications, whether those be to quality of life for families or to what educators are doing out in the field, because there always just seems to be this division. Yeah, I'm curious, Camille. Oh, Kelsey, go, and then here. Look, do you want a mic? Yeah, my laptop. Sorry, just wanted to make sure my laptop didn't fall over.
I was just going to add, Holland Bloorview had an autism summit in December, and following the summit, they created a toolkit online that's available for anybody to access. But it's been organized in a way that I think is quite accessible for parents, for clinicians, for other types of caregivers, and autistics themselves. It's categorized in really easy to follow labels, and it's a collection of best practice in a number of different areas. So it might be interesting to kind of not reinvent the wheel, but sort of collaborate and continue to add and change that as it becomes appropriate.
If I could just add one thing, I love that idea. And at one point we had planned to do something like that, and then COVID hit. But now I think it's an even better idea, what you've proposed. So let's do that. And also, I think in terms of knowledge translation for the general public, I think even though TED Talks are awesome, a lot of people don't have time to watch a full TED Talk. I mean, maybe you can make it like really short, but I think like small, short videos that highlight the key takeaways from each research group's findings, their main kind of lines of research, and how that connects to practice and impacts on family. I think that'd be really cool to develop, maybe in collaboration with ACT.
Love it. Yeah, TikTok, right? We've talked about doing podcasts and things too, so we've got lots of ideas. That's why the guys have learned how to use this fancy equipment that we have, because we want to be able to do more of those kinds of things instead of the one and done kinds of events. Grace?
So one thing in my lab we're starting to work on is developing I don't know, we haven't chosen a term yet, but like an advisory sort of group of autistic folks or, neurodivergent folks who we can go to and say, and pay, of course, but who we know we have access to and that maybe other folks would want to have access to, so that anything we do from now on, we should have input from people who are neurodivergent, right? So to have some kind of group I don't know if ACT might facilitate that.
ACT already decided to have an autistic advisory group. I mentioned it at the last board meeting, as well as an Indigenous advisory group. And we did have a person who is Cree Métis that we were hoping to get here for this event, but she wasn't able to attend at the last minute because that is something that we're hearing loud and clear. And so for me, coming in 5 months in, I sent out a survey and said, what do we want to hear? What's ACT doing well and what can we do differently? And it was more autistic voices, more neurodiversity affirming content, etc. And so we're really striving in that direction. I think Remy has a question for me, don't you? Or a comment?
Another question. It's from poor Tiffany, who's stuck on the other side of virtual reality. It's a really long email that she sent us, and I asked ChatGPT to summarize it for me, but I don't trust ChatGPT just yet. So
is it changing topic, or are we on the same topic?
It's various points, so I'm going to try my best to summarize. She has, I think, 4 different areas of discussion or concern. Continued characterization of the nature and neural basis of sensory differences across all sensory modalities and across a lifespan. That's the first one. She keeps going. I will share this with the panel afterwards. The second area is increased participation. She says, I would like to see more members of the autism community, including autistic individuals, family members, educators, doctors, and other service providers, I guess, more involved. And then better representation. We are seeing poor representation according to racial, ethnic, socioeconomic group, etc. So that's representation. More integration. She said, I typically use this term in referencing multisensory integration, and I certainly do think that we do need more research about that aspect of sensory function. So that's a very, very short summary of our 4 points. I will send that.
Thanks. Thank you. Connor.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that and just say one more thing about this possible conference, which I'm very excited about. There's a lot of mutual benefit to be had. And I think that's what Tiffany just summarized. There's a lot that researchers can be giving to the community, but also researchers will absolutely benefit. We're developing an advisory board for our research as well. I would just love to have a centralized location where people can know where to find us, where I can tell them about the research we're doing, where we can get more people involved, and where we can get the information out. Community voices are stronger together. And I really think of all of us in some sense of being in the same community, although we're representing different aspects. And there's a lot of healthcare challenges right now. Huge wait lists, not sufficient access to mental health care. There's a lot of things that could be done better, integrated care. It would be potentially very powerful for us to get together and think about what we can do as a community and get all those voices together on these issues and raising our voices about those things. So I think that's another potential benefit.
Thank you. Camila, thoughts as a parent when you're hearing all of this?
Yeah. So as a parent, like especially in my case, like I'm very busy with my son because he's like lower functioning and like he needs one-on-one attention. So I don't have time to read the like research papers, like 100 pages, like I don't have time, So if you can brief into your research and so that parents have access to read and get like, summarize it, and that would be grateful.
Great.
Yeah.
And what about participation? So you're on the receiving end of the research, but now how do we get you on the other end?
Yes, definitely. I want the parents and especially like the kids with high function, like, they can self-advocate. So they can come and, participate in these things. But my son, he can't express himself, so he can't self-advocate. So I think the parents, to be with parents and, their input would be helpful as well. Yeah.
And again, from a parent perspective, how do you feel teachers would benefit from something like this?
Definitely. Yeah, because I see that huge, gap, like collaborative, like home, and the school, and then the professionals, So it has to be a collaborative approach because I feel like I had to, with my son, I have to go and, advocate all the time, because there are certain things happening and they don't know what to do. So I basically go and I say, okay, this, So I think that collaborative approach would be really, really helpful. Yes.
So you're spending a lot of time educating educators how to support your child.
Yes, definitely. I've been doing for 13 years. Yeah, because if I don't go there and they come into different conclusion, this is happening, and then this behavior happen, I say, no, it is something else, So we are lucky we have a ABA home team, and then the behavior consultant go to school once a month, and then she just, observe and give ideas. But there are other professionals like occupational therapists and SLP involved with my son, so that input doesn't go there as much because as parents there's limited funding and so it's hard to afford to put the whole team together sometimes. So I am able to go and advocate for my son, but some cases some parents they can't because they have to go to work and do things like that. So I think that part is missing. So I think it's to be we need help with that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Pam. Thanks.
I just wanted to mention after what Connor said, we actually have a rule in our household to warn anybody within earshot before we turn on the Vitamix blender or the vacuum. And for research papers, I think putting links to the papers on the website would be great. I think there are a lot of parents who are reading academic papers. So I don't think that would be unused if that was to be done. I also had a question for Tiffany, and that was the toddler videos that were shown in the presentation showed parents who had vastly different interactions with their children in the observation section, from kneeling and playing with them to being in a chair, not really watching the interaction, but being on a phone. I'm just wondering if there's any control between the intervention group and the control group for autistic attributes, whether diagnosed or not, in the parents. I don't assume there's any lack of connection between the parent and child, but perhaps there's differences in how the parents react in a research setting that might skew the results or affect recommendations.
Thank you. Tiffany, perhaps we know you can hear us, but perhaps you can enter into chat a response to that piece. And Remy, you heard the bit about the professional literature onto the website, so that's good news. Thanks, fam. Comments? Grace, Alina, were you going to, you sort of had your hand up? I've suspected the same, which is why I raised it. Right. Right. Exactly. Thank you. King, did you have a response from Tiffany back there, or? Okay, sorry.
Grace agrees.
So Grace
thinks
agrees.
that parents and some autistic adults are actually better informed than some researchers because they're doing so much reading.
Yeah, great points. Thank you.
While we wait for Tiffany's response, I do have a thought, which is about sort of the proposed directions for research. You know, Tiffany shared a bunch, and Anna Maria, you were raising a point, the double empathy point, and the need for the neurodivergent perspective on neurotypical sensory processing. That is very similar to an idea that I think is very much underexplored in the research. There's a couple of studies, but there's not much on the sort of neurodivergent perspective on neurotypical sensory spaces, on the sensory environments they're created by neurotypical people and how they are affecting neurodivergent people. We still need a lot more, don't get me wrong, on like the characterization and the measurement and the understanding of the neurodivergent sensory experiences, which we still very poorly understand, and we do have a lot of measurement issues there, don't get me wrong, that's still needed, but we have even less about sort of understanding the neurotypical sensory environments and how, we should be changing those, what constitutes an accessible versus an inaccessible environment. And as was mentioned before today, or maybe yesterday, I can't even remember now, the conflicting access needs, that was today, when different people have different, sort of sensory profiles, and how do you sort of reconcile those and create a space that will allow both of those folks to, have a positive experience and be feeling meaningfully included there. And I think I see Remy coming with a response from Tiffany, maybe?
I think you might be right, Patrick. A brief response. Parents are given standard instructions at the beginning of each sample. They do vary according to the measure being collected. So that's in response to why some families are sitting on a chair, others may not be. We have not measured parents' autistic traits in our past samples. I intend to do so going forward based on many of the helpful comments from conference attendees today. Thank you.
There are a few studies now on the experiences of autistic parents, of autistic people, especially autistic mothers or at least female at birth people. Very underexplored though, very underexplored.
I add just a very quick comment to that. Is what I wondered about with that educational difference. I wondered as well along that line if that could have been contributing to that, because we do know that educational outcomes in general aren't as good for people that are neurodivergent, without appropriate supports. So I was thinking along those lines too. And I thought maybe we should have a rapid speed dating at the conference. Mm-hmm. Researchers, questions coming in, and we can do a little scoring match at the end.
Cool. I love the idea of the conference too. So Patrick, I think there's a foundation in the U.S. that was just started by a group of musicians, actors, and sports people that's working on making their spaces more accommodating, and the spaces are there for everybody, but specifically designed for neurodivergent people to go and have a break from music. And the drummer from Imagine Dragons is one of the people who was starting it. His mom was one of my professors, so that's how I know that. But what I really wanted to talk about, or at least throw out there, is like the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system, and for me somewhere that's where some of the anxiety comes. Like, how long does your sympathetic system take to, or how reactive is it to a sensory input, and then how long does the other system take to bring you back to a state of calm, and how do you measure that?
Just in terms of thinking about future directions of research, and I think it's been this is what I'm hearing. I feel like it would be so great to reach out to even other professions like architecture and interior design and maybe lighting engineers, landscape architecture, because this will be another way to disseminate, honestly, what we're learning about and how to create environments. And there's also a lot of expertise here in BC for that as well. My husband recently went back to school for landscape architecture, and his final project was a sensory garden for kids on the spectrum, trying to control based on the design of the space, where it would be very low sensory kind of environment to a very, very stimulating one, and you could take different paths through the garden. And I think he partly did this because he needed to talk to an expert for his project, and he had one at home that was doing autism work, but it wasn't a bad idea. And when I feel like I could have been a much better expert for him, honestly, if I had been at this conference before. But I think that's another thing for us to think about in terms of disseminating research, is like, how do we actually change environments, right? In terms of healthcare and mental health provision, but also in terms of designing these spaces. So.
Great points. Yes, Carrie, right? Yes.
So I'm a mommy and a grad student, a mommy of a kiddo on the spectrum who he was not doing so great in grade 4, so I pulled him out and read everybody's research from around the world and built a space designed to be sensory sensitive with the architects and the colors and the lighting and the flooring and the sound absorption. And it has all the different kinds of chairs. There's beanbag chairs, and there's height adjustable chairs, and there's all this stuff. And we started off with skides, but now we're with nides, so that it can be, there's all the autonomy of choice and how long you work on something and how, so it's everything that you guys talk about, how I wish I had this when I was a kid, and I wish I had that. And so all of their baseline is brought down because they're not in fight or flight, so that, their emotional elevator is at the floor, so they can learn. And so I'm trying to figure out the right master's thesis to do, but it's so if you guys want to see how all of your stuff together actually works for these guys and reduces their self-harm and increases their graduation rates and all this stuff, it's in BC, it's a registered charity, it's happening. So if you want to see all of this stuff that you guys have researched in person, it's not very far away. So it all works. All the stuff you guys do, it works very well.
Thank you. Could you enter URLs into chat for that? Just locations. Okay. That would be great. Okay, so we are coming up close to time, and those who know me well know that I like to get things done, and I like to be concrete. And as Kang said to me in my early days in ACT, I think you're a kind of shoot now, ask questions later girl, aren't you? And he's pretty right on that. But the point is, I like to get things done. And so if we were to sit here now, we have all these conversations, we talk about these things that would be nice. Let's say that a year from now, what concrete things would we have done to know that we were making steps in the right direction? Concrete steps.
Have a conference planned.
Maybe a grant to fund a conference.
Yeah.
So it actually happens.
I think we need a task force, like a working group.
Yeah, with both, researchers and professionals, family members, self-advocates, some good representation, making sure that we're being mindful of everybody intersectionality, without putting too much of a burden on everybody who's being asked to be the token voice for XYZ intersection.
And to get everybody at the table too, because if you have representatives from different groups, then, the scientists can bring the scientists, the families can bring families, providers can bring other providers from different disciplines.
Other ideas? Awesome. Kelsey and then Remy.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say, I'll give it to Remy. No, I was going to say, I love the idea that Kelsey had around creating a toolkit that's informed by, and updated every year. So I don't know if we can start working on something like that. I know you have so many resources already on the website, but it might be worth looking at other models. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to put Kelsey on.
No, that's great. Thanks.
Let's see. This is a while ago, but it's still relevant, I think. Comment from Carla Chrisman online. Breathe and Weave Health Summit across silos was very powerful. Everyone participating, collaborating, co-creating. And a separate comment from Carla as well. Professionals working with our children need more education and understanding how to help our children excel, enable good lives. And inclusive environments, of course. A voice from First Nations too, that's from Sarah, and gender nonconforming too. More comments coming in. Breaking down the barriers to services, training professionals. And thanks to all the people online, by the way, they've been great.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I love that breathe and weave point. I think that's the metaphor is really a profound metaphor, breathe and weave across these various areas. So, Kelsey? Otherwise, we don't get you on the recording. That's the issue.
I guess I just wanted to emphasize, as part of this planning for the conference, to include the school, at a high level, the decision makers.
And I think the key piece is at the high level there, potentially even ministry folks.
Yes.
Right?
Michelle, the other thing, I want to find a way of increasing capacity in community for physicians to do more of this work, because it just doesn't exist,
An echo.
So,
do an echo.
yeah. And part of it, I think, a new CIHR grant on Autism Echo from Ontario, but I just feel like physicians need to start doing more research in their clinics, and how do we build capacity, because we have a substantive amount of privilege and power, and we are in a way also frontline, but I'm never at conferences with other doctors, other MDs,
Right.
So how do we increase capacity there?
Right.
I do like the idea of an echo, though, too. Mm-hmm. For example, for physicians, OTs, to be able to call in and...
Can you just explain what that is to people who might
sorry.
not know?
Do you want to, Patrick? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, me? Oh, well, I'm not an expert on it at all, but it's a sort of model where you have people who are sort of really specific experts in different areas, and then you have physicians out in the community, maybe in rural areas or places where they're under-resourced, and they have these clients coming in with complex caseloads, or it could be physicians, it could be anybody, whoever it is that's being supported, and then in the echo, you can discuss those things and do sort of a training around it. I don't do echoes myself. I know people who do them.
Yeah, and they've got some pretty good research to support them, I want to say. I don't know if it's perfect, but for example, if you did one on anxiety and autism, it would be a way to get a lot of anxiety and autism experts and for OTs and pediatricians, et cetera, to kind of call in and get some consultation on a case, which I think is really helpful. And we were talking about this too, Michelle, to not just hear from an expert as in a presentation and then try and take it home and apply it on your own without any further guidance and you're not sure if you're doing it correctly. I think there's also research would support that it's much more effective in terms of changing behavior for people to be able to connect in some way with experts on a more repeated basis to get some kind of consultation. Yeah.
Yes, we've actually been having conversations about doing that for teachers too. Heather Brown, who I met because of Patrick, actually Patrick's mom, Mary Ellen, who does our Facebook page for ACT, said, oh, you're in Ottawa for CALS. Heather Brown is there. She's a friend of Patrick's. They've worked together. And Heather, like Anna Marie, is a former teacher. And all of her work is focused on teaching educators what to do in their classrooms to support autistic students. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is how we can do something that's really long-term. I've said a million times, enough with the one and done, because that doesn't change practice. We need something that's ongoing.
Okay, I hate to throw a wrench in all of these good ideas, but I think often we're preaching to the converted.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And what we need to do more of is get out to places where we know people are not going to come to us, right? Like, how do we do that? I don't want to, target doctors, but doctors are usually really, really busy, usually don't have many incentives to come to conferences. You are an exception. Getting a pediatrician to come to these things would be like a small miracle.
Like, I didn't mean to just say no to echoes, but what I was referring to is about building more capacity for community-based research, Because, like, potentially you could have the researchers be available. We know what we're seeing, right? We know the problems. We sit there and, it's hard enough to hear one story, but I'm hearing 20 a day of the similar barriers, similar, families burnt out, families at family distress scale, it goes from 1 to 10, they'll be at a 9 or 10 all the time, families, parents not being able to go to work because the system doesn't provide adequate supports, single parent families having to, give up care into MCFD because they're not appropriately supported, right? And so, I cannot sit still and be like, well, there's nothing I can do. And so I've turned to research for that, but that's me. But I'm busy, but it's not funded, right? Because the clinical assistant professorship doesn't hold with it any funding. And then you apply for grants and you can't get funded. And so I think a way of partnering with people that I'm not the only one that's uncomfortable, but I may be one of the few that's pushing forward and trying to break through that, community academics. I don't know what that is, Mm-hmm. Can we find a way of supporting that somehow,
but maybe
right?
that's the key, I think, just with any, a cultural group. When we want to get into a cultural group, we got to have somebody from that culture that we partner with. So I think, you would be the bridge to other pediatricians, right? Possibly. I'm just thinking, it's the hardest thing. I think of all the times I've run into reports from, I won't name the organization, where they're missing autism when I clearly see it from a report that they've written, right? And I feel like knocking on the door and saying, you know what, you're missing some of these cases. I can help you figure out why you're missing, right? But I have to go knocking on their door. They're not coming to me, right? How do we get there? How do we connect with these folks, right?
So what you're saying, I actually spoke to earlier, which is what I see as a problem, that the systems are not in place. So if I go back 6, 7, 8, I don't know how many years, I hate to say, but when I was on the panel with Robin Friedlander, because of ACT, moderated by Vic Dua, Elisa Lipson, I believe, was on the panel, and she was head of BC Pediatrics at that point, I think, or was connected. And then guess what? We worked together. She's on the ACT board now. And then following her, Avon Pointer and I, we worked closely together. She was the pediatric piece, I was the education. We were like co-presenting at conferences. I don't know who the president of BC Pediatrics is now since Avon left. So those, I think, are the pieces, right? We meet these individuals and then that relationship ends because that person retires or whatever. And this is happening because the systems that are needed aren't actually in place. So Elisa Lipson, who's on the board, when we were wanting to try to boost sales for Amy Weatherby, she said, I can get you an ad out through BC Pediatric Society. And I said, do it. And we had to pay for it, but boom, we got it out there. But timing wasn't great, so people weren't able to attend. But we've got that. Now I know that. It's in my head. It's like, okay, next time we want pediatricians here. Let's do like a Friday afternoon, all day Saturday, perhaps, or something like that. So I think that that's a really important point, and I can think of ways to connect with that group for sure.
Yeah, I'm also part of like a couple of mentorship groups, and those are CME, so we have to do an amount of training, I'm sure all professionals do, right, per year. And so like a mentorship group potentially with, because then it's open to the province, to clinicians across the province, maybe 10 people might sign up, but then you're speaking to a group that's already like invested and interested, so you're not talking to the people that are not interested, to have a group of...
I think the interest is there, like neuropsych at Children's reached out and said, can you come and do something to talk about the work that ACT does? And that was very well received. So I think that the interest is there. It's, again, it was Robin knew what I was doing, so he said, can you do this?
I will make one point that community is very different than hospital-based. Like a whole other world.
Good point.
And so as a community provider, I think that we need to, elevate what's happening in the community. And not just pediatricians, but the community health clinics, all of that.
Thank you.
Thinking of the pediatricians, well, it's like for someone like yourself to help design the research with the help, with collaboration with someone else on the panel, and then looking at the pediatricians as data collectors, because that might be something that more of might be able to do, or it may fit within the paradigm, so it's not too much of a shift for them. And then I also wanted to make a pitch for something completely different about safe spaces. So I had gone to a few meetings because they're building a new school in the West End where I live. And so I was invited to come and share my thoughts about it. And so they thought I was going to talk about aging in place because it's also a community center, but I really wanted to talk about the lack of clinical spaces within the schools. And the person who was in charge of this was somebody who is a bureaucrat who oversees the design and building of the school. And he said, well, there will be no clinical spaces within that building. And I said to him, well, this has been like 20, 30 years that we've been talking about sensory differences, individual differences, and the needs for these spaces. So I don't understand what the problem is. And I wasn't invited back, but I think, so then how do we, like, knowing that that is a bit of a linchpin in who needs to be kind of poked at to get a response, so that we're actually building the schools so that they can support the kids that we see.
When you say clinical space, do you mean like an OT? When you say clinical space, what do you mean? Is that like an sensory
room, like sensory therapy room, or anything? Yeah. Okay.
Or even a quiet space.
Yeah.
There's nothing separate so that somebody can have a break.
Yeah. Leadership at the very top is needed for those kinds of initiatives.
Just a very quick add-on to that. Right before I left the mainstream schools and went to sides, they were demolishing the middle school that I was going to continue at through grade 8 and replacing it with this other building with really narrow hallways. They were making the hallways even narrower than they already were. I don't know what the heck they were thinking, but clearly sensory needs were not on their radar.
And that's a Ministry of Ed and childcare piece. Like, I know when I've worked with architectures around school designs, like they'll have rules around sizes of rooms and things like that. So it's like even above that person's pay grade.
A few comments. Interesting. Carla Chrisman says to bridge the gap between mental health and developmental disabilities and support from birth to death. So continuity of treatment. I think that was mentioned before. That's interesting. And then Sarah agreed, yes, the whole lifespan. And her work has been so improved since she began providing OT to clients across ages. So that's an interesting comment. And then Carla also advocates for linking with existing places like the BC Safety Quality Council. And a comment about community from Maryland. Community is very different, meeting people where they are at and very stretched. Try to understand this, especially in early intervention, which historically has been able to manage more intensity of intervention.
Thank you. Any other final comments? Who wants the last word? The last word of the day.
I don't have anything really exciting to say. I'm not going to take the last word unless I have something to say.
Okay. Camille?
I would like to thank you, all the researchers and all the professionals, that all the the work that you are doing to help our kids. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Anna Maria? Nicole?
Happy Friday.
Okay. Connor?
This is a fantastic experience. I feel like I learned a lot, and I got a lot of ideas. This always happens to me when I get in a room with a lot of engaged, passionate, smart people, as I end up leaving with a to-do list about 100 things, but that's okay. That's exciting, and I think it was really, really productive.